Hello and welcome to our 2020 Alex Awards celebration. Coming to you from various homes, both across the country and abroad. I'm Paula Gallagher, and I was the chair of the 2020 Alex Awards Committee. And I am here with a number of my committee members and also a number of our authors, our award-winning authors, here to talk to you today about the Alex Awards, and we thought you might want to hear more from our authors. This is the logo for the Alex Awards. And what are the Alex Awards? The Alex Awards are given to 10 adult books that appeal to teens ages 12 to 18. And these are awards that are given to books from the previous publishing year. So 2020 honors books that came out in 2019. The award began in 1998 with a task force, and they were looking to recognize the adult books that are read by teens and also to honor Margaret Edwards. And I'll talk about her in just a moment. But they became an official award of ALA, and that's the American Library Association, in 2002. We are part of the Youth Media Awards, and those are some more probably recognizable awards, award names like the Newbery and the Caldecott. We're part of that same group. So Margaret Alexander Edwards, so you might guess that that's where Alex comes from, her middle name. She was known to her friends as Alex, was a champion of library services for young adults, and we think that she was one of the first, and she became an authority on literature for teens. And back when she was working and when she started, there really weren't specifically teen books, so she was working with adult books with teen appeal. She was the Adult Services Learning Coordinator at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore City. And she developed one of the earliest public library programs for the promotion and encouragement of reading among teenagers. And I included both her, sort of official portrait, but also here on the right, you'll see, and it's a very grainy photo from the Baltimore Sun newspaper from back in 1940. And she rented a horse-drawn wagon, and she had it specially fitted with shelving, and she knew it was important to get these books out into the community. And so she went into underserved communities in Baltimore City, and she was very targeted about this. She knew she was going in at about 4 o'clock when people were sitting out on their stoops. And if you know anything about Baltimore, we are a city of row houses that don't have porches by and large, but there are stairs, stoops that people will sit on, often marble stoops. And she had a xylophone, and she would play the tones of the xylophone, and people would come and she would hand them books. And she was specifically targeting teens. And so when Margaret Edwards passed away, there was a trust endowed in her name. And the Margaret Edwards Trust funds the Alex Awards in conjunction with Booklist magazine, which was a production of ALA. This picture is a picture of our whole Alex committee. The 9 of us who read hundreds of books and spent countless hours dissecting and discussing and debating the merits of the books that we read. And this is the listing of the names of our Alex Award Committee. Myself, Paula Gallagher, Dr. Pat Coots, Jenny Law, who is with us today, Amber Peterson, Candace Reeder, who is with us today, Carrie Charette, who is also with us, Lori Vaughn, Courtney Waters, Rachel Webb, who is with us, and our booklist consultant was Julia Smith. And the committee members who I didn't say who are with us, they're all viewing today, but they are not part of our panel who will be talking to our authors. So I'd like to thank all of them for all of their hard work for more than a year on the Alex Awards. So these are our winners. So out of all those hundreds of books, we winnowed those down to nominees. Everyone read the nominees. Then we had an official list of nominees, and we had our 10 winners. And so we would like to talk to our authors who are here today. We have with us today C.A. Fletcher, Angie Cruz, Maia Kobabe. We have Tegan and Sarah Quinn, A.J. Dungo, Seanan McGuire. We also have Casey McQuiston. I want to show you, before we get started with questions for our authors, the winning authors do receive an Alex Award medal, and this is what it looks like. And you'll see the image of Margaret Edwards and a quote from Margaret Edwards about our young adults who in a few short years will be guiding the nation. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. And the YALSA office will get in touch with you over the summer about getting this to you. And so we're going to get started with Dominicana by Angie Cruz. Candy, can you take over for us, please?
Sure, thank you. In 1965, 15-year-old Ana Cancion leaves the Dominican Republic, married to a man twice her age, and eventually discovers her own voice in Washington Heights, New York. Through historical fiction, this powerful immigrant story is increasingly relevant today. So Angie, thank you for coming. Ooh.
Thank you for having me.
Sorry, lost you for a moment there. So our first question is, during your research process, you were unable to find Dominican women represented in the official archives at the City University of New York. So you formed your own Instagram photo archive. Can you tell us a little bit about how this started and what is included in your Instagram account, Dominicanas NYC?
Oh, thank you so much for bringing it up. And I encourage everyone to go look at it. When I started working on the novel over a decade ago, I specifically was looking for stories of working class women in Washington Heights, New York City, in general, around the 60s and 70s. And in the official archives, there was very little. So I ended up interviewing friends, friends of family members, and visiting their apartments and looking in their albums and trying to map through all the scraps of story or the things that weren't said and the images that I found, what I imagined that time to look like for them in particular. And also for my family who came into the United States in the 1970s. So the process of looking at photographs and listening to people tell their story was so joyous. And I thought that it would be wonderful now that we have Instagram to involve all the communities that wanted to participate in building this, like what I call a living archive.
Okay, thank you. Dominicana is a vital portrait of the immigrant experience, but it's also a story of a mother and a daughter and the transactional marriage that was arranged to better their family and help them immigrate to the US. As you've been traveling the country and speaking to groups all over, have you discovered that does this story cross cultures? And is it the same story or very similar for many first-generation Americans?
I mean, I think that what's been really fulfilling in sharing this story with the world is that, I'm sorry, it's very loud here, is that people from all walks of life and different generations have read the book and have known of someone or have family members that where the story really resonates with their own experience. And you know, the truth is that all over the world, there's migration, there's displacement, young women, young teens are vulnerable all over the world in a way that Anna's vulnerable. the numbers for domestic violence and abuse are very high all over the world, including the United States. So I feel like the exciting part of sharing this book is that it's become a way for people to talk about issues that I often silenced.
Thank you. Your book has received numerous awards and was chosen as the inaugural book for Good Morning America's book club, as well as the New York City 2019 Word Up Uptown Reads. This isn't your first novel, but it's really been a breakout book. Has this changed your life in any way, and does it place a lot more pressure on you as you begin to write your next book?
I definitely don't feel pressure in that way, but this is the first book that a lot of my family members have read. When my book was announced in Times Square on the, in the Turbotron, a lot of my family members realized that I was actually a writer and they went off to buy the book. And that's been really beautiful, actually, because the book is loosely based on my mother's arrival story to the United States. And in some ways, it's created an intimacy among us that we didn't have before. And we've been able to talk about some of the issues that are that have been prevalent, but again, unspoken. So.
Okay, thank you. Well, it was an honor to speak to you. We loved your book.
Thank you so much.
So I will pick up. I am so honored to be speaking to AJ Dungo about his graphic memoir, In Waves. In this beautiful graphic memoir, perfectly cast in muted beach tones, Dungo interweaves his story of first love with his girlfriend's passion for surfing, her heroism in the face of cancer, and a primer on the history of surfing. So hi, AJ, thank you so much for being here. In Waves is a very personal story. What has it been like to share such a deeply personal story of love and loss with a wide audience of strangers? How have audiences reacted, and have you heard from any teens specifically?
Been quite surreal. At the time I wrote this not too long after my partner had passed away, so it was very raw, and I was doing it out of necessity, and I didn't even think about an audience. It was just about finishing it for her and sort of remembering as much as I could in the moment. But the reaction has been unbelievable. I didn't realize I was writing to such a wide audience because it seemed so specific and personal. But I guess, the themes of grief and loss and love are universal, which I should have known about beforehand. But yeah, teens have definitely been some of the most affected. But amazingly, people of all ages have come to me at signings or reached out online, and the responses have been deeply, deeply personal. As we all feel when we read something, we feel like we're having a deep connection with the person writing the book. So I think they feel the same with this book, which was surprising. I didn't expect it at all, but it's been overwhelming.
Well, I've personally been moved by it. I read it a second time just this week in preparation for this, and I was moved just as much the second time reading it that I was the first. So those universal themes definitely do speak out to everyone. This is your first graphic novel. How was In Waves shaped by your editor?
Right. It's my first book. I had just graduated right out of art school, and I had the opportunity to work with a publisher named Nobrow in the UK. So it was an ongoing conversation. We had a sort of pen pal relationship. It was just a correspondence via email. I'd send a draft, and they'd make notes, and they were always generally helpful. And because I have never written before, I consider myself more of an illustrator. I definitely took all the help I could, but it was mostly just they're sort of like the bumpers at a bowling alley. They're keeping me on point and sort of giving me the perspective of the reader where I was maybe lacking in describing something or giving more context. They were sort of urging me to open up, maybe reveal more, maybe consider different viewpoints. So ultimately their editors had helped me make the book more of a meaningful experience for the reader.
I love that metaphor, bumpers in a bowling alley. That's a good one. I'm curious about the research you did for this project. Did you start your research into the history of surfing when you were with Kristen, or did that process begin when you started creating In Waves?
It definitely started between the two. So Kristen had passed away when I was in my graduating term at school. And coincidentally, I had a class that sort of required me to make a project about California and sort of encapsulate something about California to someone in Europe, because we were going to London and that's where I met my publisher. But basically, I was encouraged by two teachers at my school, and they knew it. I had recently got into surfing, and they gave me all these resources. And I need to shout out a man named Clive Piercy, amazing man, graphic designer, legendary. He passed away recently, but he's the one who he poured all his resources and books onto me, and he gave me so many different things. He worked for Roxy and Quicksilver in the 90s and was sort of reshaping their image and responsible for you know, the whole girl surfing movement in a sense, like aesthetically. And so he got me started. And when I got the book deals, when I just like ran to the nearest bookstore and started reading as much as I could, because I knew about as much as the average reader, which was nothing. So it started in between.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your work and for being here, AJ. I look forward to sharing your book with even more teens going forward.
Thank you, Carrie.
I'm going to pass it on now to Jenny, who has a few questions for Charlie Fletcher.
Hello. Hey. Hi. So this is a boy and dog at the end of the world. And in a dystopian future where the world's population is believed to be only in the thousands, Grizz lives on an isolated island. When a charismatic stranger arrives and absconds with one of the family's beloved dogs, the 16-year-old embarks on a quest to get her back. Hello, Charlie.
Hi.
We just have a few questions about this book.
Mm-hmm.
A boy and his dog at the end of the world causes readers to make certain assumptions, which are then completely upended. Is this something you had in mind from the beginning of writing?
Yes, it is. It's difficult for me to do it without spoilers, but I'm going to try. Everybody talks about the unreliable narrator. And I thought it'd be interesting to do a book about the unreliable reader, because I'm definitely the unreliable reader. I read very fast and I often miss stuff. So apart from the main idea of the book, which is to set a dystopian, not dystopian, but a post-apocalyptic novel that didn't involve zombies or anything particularly dramatic, but just took place in an empty world where humanity had basically got old and died and there were very few left. I wanted to write a book set in an empty world. And it struck me that, yes, of course, that meant, since I was going to write it in the first person, I had an unreliable narrator, because if your family lives an isolated existence on the very edge of the world after the end of the world, you don't have the internet doesn't exist, but you don't have any real big, wide perspective on what happened. So you'd only know a little bit of the story. You'd only know what had been handed down by the people around you. So I knew I had an unreliable narrator anyway. And that gave me license, since I was writing in the first person, to having fun is the wrong word, but I'll cop to it, to have some fun with the reader. And I think the story barrels along and is engaging, but I think if you don't pay close attention, certain things surprise you as you go along and make you go back and try and figure out where you missed stuff, which makes it sound much cleverer than it is. But it was, I enjoyed doing that because I liked the idea of a story where the reader was almost more of a participant than normal, because you'd have to go back and read a bit again.
Now, do you know, and are you willing to share what caused the dystopic conditions that are the setting of your book?
Well, as I said, basically what happened was that people stopped being able to have kids. And so humanity just very quietly died out. No big drama particularly. The world just got old and wheezed its way out. And a tiny, tiny fraction of the population remained and were able to have children. And in the world of the book, there are probably less than 10,000 people across the whole planet. But in my mind, what had happened, I'm afraid, was a virus coming out of the East. But in my mind, it was a virus coming out of shellfish farming. It was the kind of shellfish farming that happens there. And all it did was just switch off our ability to have kids. And I kind of wish I hadn't written that. But I didn't write it, but I wish that wasn't in my notebook, and that wasn't what was in my mind when it happened. But I did like this idea of just a soft, my editor, who's pretty smart, described it as a soft apocalypse. I wanted to write a story after a soft apocalypse. And in a way, the book hangs between two of my heroes, one of which is James Lovelock, who promoted the Gaia theory about the world essentially being this huge connected organism that will in the end protect itself, which we may or may not be in the grip of at the moment with various things. And the other is Freeman Dyson, who died a couple of months ago, very sadly, who had this vision of incredibly optimistic, almost spiritual belief in the power of science to preserve life, if not humanity, and project it forward into the future. And so the book, I'm talking to librarians, so I can be pretentious about this, but I would never say it to the, to many people, but it hangs between those two visions of the world. And that's why the world stopped, is because just too much of us happened to it. And what is happening is nature is slowly taking it back in what I hope is quite an optimistic and non-threatening way.
Thank you. Your book is a love letter to the relationship between a kid and their dog. Can you tell us about any special dogs in your life?
Well, we don't have long enough for all the special dogs in my life, but I was an only child. My parents gave me the best present you could possibly give any kid on my 5th birthday. I walked into the larder, was told to walk into the larder, there was something there for me, and there was my childhood dog, who was called Robert, who was a golden retriever, and he lasted me from 5 to 22. And he was just the most tremendous friend. He was like a brother, and he was not allowed to sleep on my bed, so he would always sleep beside my bed till my parents left, and then he would sleep on my bed, which I'm pretty sure my parents knew. And he was just always there, and I was devastated. I'm ashamed to say I was slightly more devastated when my dog died than when my grandmother's died. That's a terrible thing to say, but he was so much part of my life, everyday life, that I deeply, deeply regretted the passing of my grandmother's, but it was like a brother. So, and when he died, my father, who was not a necessarily very articulate man about emotion, wrote me a very sweet letter because I was at university, and he said, you will, with any luck, get many beautiful dogs in your life, but you're kind of guaranteed 2 great dogs, if you're lucky. And one is the dog that you grew up with as a child, and the other is the dog you see your children grow up with. And I can testify to the truth of that, because the second great dog in my life was called Archie, and he is the dog that Jip in this book is based upon. And he was a completely different kind of dog. He was a Feld Terrier, and he'd had all the virtues of a terrier and none of the negative sides. He was just a huge, great heart. And he, again, lasted about the same length through my kids' life into their 20s. So that was pretty good. And he died in the last 2 months before I handed in this book, which is about a dog called Jip. And in the week I handed the book in to my editor, friends of ours from the village where we got Archie said, oh, there's a sign up in the local shop saying someone's got some puppies. And Archie's father was very notorious for getting out and having sex with local dogs. And they said, there's every chance it's the same bloodline. So my wife immediately went and said, well, I'll just go and have a look. And then immediately said, yes, we'll have it. So now Jip in the book, we now have our own Jip, because we had to name him after the dog in the book. And he is another terrier. And I hope for another 17 years of greatness out of him.
And one last one, have you considered returning to the world that you created in this book?
I have, and the book after the one I'm finishing at the moment is called The Pale Girls. And if you read the book, the anti-hero, the the sort of villain, but not necessarily villain, refers to two of his sisters. And so the next book tells a story in the same world from the perspective of his sisters, who of course wonder what happened to him, since something does happen to him at the end of this book. And it's called The Pale Girls. And it takes us from Scandinavia, from the islands, from the Swedish islands around Copenhagen, down south and to parts south and east, but not west, sadly.
Well, thank you so much, Charlie. We loved your book, and congratulations.
That's a pleasure.
Okay. Well, I have some questions for, okay. So our next author is Maia Kobabe. Kobabe's path to understanding gender and sexuality comes into beautiful focus in this graphic memoir, evocatively illustrated with retro colors and clear, simple lines. Maia, what was it like for you to share so intimately about yourself, and what kind of reactions have you gotten from your readers?
It was nerve-wracking to share this book, and the response has been overwhelming. So this is a memoir. It's based on my own life. The main themes are gender identity, sexuality, coming out to friends and family, coworkers, professionally. And I wrote it in huge part because I was starting to come out as gender non-binary to my family and having a really hard time explaining that in conversation, just constantly getting caught on not being able to fully explain what I was trying to say, or, starting a really deep conversation, but it's interrupted by, the needs of life, like it's time to make dinner, or someone asks you a side question, you get on its tangent. And I just felt like I could never fully express what I was trying to express in conversation. So it was almost like a certain amount of frustration, like I have to sit down and write about this because I'm just not getting it across just in words. And I love comics. Comics is my medium. I have a major in comics. So I sat down to write it and draw it because I thought that there's a lot of things you can do with words and pictures that you can't do with one or the other alone. I am, despite the fact that I've published a revealing memoir, a fairly introverted and somewhat private person. So I had some hesitations. I mean, I had worries, I guess, about releasing this. Also because pretty much every queer book gets some kind of pushback. Queer books are often the ones that are most commonly banned in libraries, and I end up on the banned books list. So I braced myself for a certain amount of negative pushback. But the response has been overwhelming. The first printing of the book sold out the week that the book was released, and we had to order a second printing like immediately. And the amount of readers I've had reach out to me online, like the first couple of months it was out, I was getting an email almost every single day mostly from non-binary teenagers or queer teenagers, questioning people or parents who had kids who had come out recently. So I would say that the response has been, like, I kind of braced myself for a wave of online hate, and what I got instead was a wave of online love. And that has been just tremendous.
Oh, that's really wonderful to hear. There are just so many beautiful images in this book involving natural objects. What kind of references did you work from for this?
I mean, I pulled from all kinds of things. I went to Waldorf school as a kiddo. If anyone knows about that, it's a private sort of arts education where you do a lot of gardening and handcrafts, like weaving and knitting and embroidery. So I had spent a lot of time in gardens and working with my plants. My mom is a gardener. I volunteer part-time on a farm. So that's part of why there are like nature images in there. I've also just loved children's book illustration ever since I was a kid. I have so many favorite illustrators, and I was inspired by other cartoonists. So Alison Bechtel, queer cartoonist who wrote Fun Home, just turned into a Broadway musical, is a huge inspiration. Erica Moen, who's a webcomic artist who draws a webcomic called Oh Joy Sex Toy, really helped me become comfortable talking about sex and sexuality and bodies and sexual health and those sorts of topics. Lucy Nisley is another cartoonist I absolutely love, who does tons of wonderful memoir work. I was really inspired by her color palette and like her very simple, clear lines, and almost this idea that you when you're drawing a memoir that's set in the modern times, then mostly what you're showing is images of things that people are already familiar with. Like you're not showing some of this detailed fantasy world that you need to build for your readers. Set in the present day, that you can really kind of shorthand things down to just their simplest form, especially if what you're really trying to get across is like message and content. So what I tried was draw sort of as much as I needed to tell the story, but never more, because I only really sort of broke out really like more detailed and design-based pages when I was trying to like really get across like an emotional moment. So like I have several full-page spreads, and one is like discovering like David Bowie music for the first time, and sort of like the transcendent experience of hearing like what sounded like queer themes in music lyrics, like as like a teenager, or a feeling of like, you know, like that spiral of thoughts that kind of goes through your head when you're trying to figure out like what your maybe identity and sexuality is when you don't have the language for it yet. So I sort of tried to balance between like images that would hopefully like inspire thought, and then also like very simple sort of like a style whenever what I really just wanted was like the message, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and I think you nailed it in this graphic memoir. It was really excellent. And one final question: your sibling Phoebe was a colorist for your memoir. What was your working relationship like?
So I have just one sibling, and we're very close. I'm the older sibling by 2 years, and I mostly work traditionally. Most work is done with pens and pencils on paper, but the publisher really wanted the colors to be done digitally to give it more of sort of like a contemporary look, which I thought was the right decision. Luckily, my sibling is a digital artist, very convenient. And so as soon as we sort of decided on digital colors, I was like, I want to work with Phoebe on this book. This was a sort of a huge sort of leap into the unknown for both of us. It's my first full-length graphic novel. It was Phoebe's first time coloring a book. So we were both kind of just leaping in, being like, we don't know this, but we're gonna figure it out as we go along. But there were many reasons. One is I love Phoebe. They're basically my best friend, but they live 8 hours away from me, so we don't get to visit as much as we'd like. So I knew that if we worked together on this book, it would mean we would get to do like lots of phone calls, do some visits. You know, we could work in sort of like catching up and keeping in touch with each other into the working process. Also, because it's a story of my childhood, like it's a story of Phoebe's childhood as well. Like they were there for all of the memories too. So I kind of wanted them to be there as like a sounding board and like a fact checker and almost like an accountability buddy. Like, does this seem totally wildly different from how you remember this incident? I also knew that there'd be a ton of things that I wouldn't have to explain to Phoebe, that I would have to explain if I was working with a colorist who didn't know me. So I wouldn't have to say things like send them photographs like, this is the color of our childhood home, or like, this is the hair color of our aunt, you know, or even sort of more emotional things like I want this scene to be very warm because that was the quality of light in our grandparents' house. You know, all of these sort of things that were both sort of factual, but also like emotional. Because Phoebe was there, they could help me sort of evoke, I just felt like it was just, you know, all these things that I wouldn't have to explain because they would just know. And it was absolutely wonderful working with Phoebe on this. We basically finished it and we're like, all right, well, when can we do another book together? Because that was great. And yeah, at the very start of the process, Phoebe drove up from LA and stayed with me for like a week, and we actually sat next to each other at a desk, and I was sitting, you know, on my one computer doing the digital liner, and I would just email the Phoebe the files, and Phoebe was sitting next to me on another computer, like working and would turn the screen to me like, what do you think, you know, what do you think of this? And I think Phoebe wanted like really detailed feedback, but I was just like, looks great, love it, keep going. And Phoebe would be like, please give me some feedback. And I'd be like, I love you. So I just wanted to be like the easiest client ever to work with, basically. So yeah, it was a really delightful experience. There are definitely some scenes in this book that were very hard to write. Anyone who's already read it will know that there are some very traumatic pap smear exam scenes in the book that were not fun to write. Those were the scenes where I would be crying at my desk while working on the pages. But any scene in which I got to draw Phoebe as a character on the page was also like my very favorite scenes to write, because it felt like being able to visit them, being able to write about them.
That's awesome. Well, we loved genderqueer, and I have found so many readers for it in my library, and I kind of just want to hand it to pretty much everybody I meet. So keep up the great work, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And up next is Seanan McGuire's Middlegame. Roger and Dodger are twins created in a lab in order to bestow their creator with the power to shape reality, but only if they don't figure out how to manifest that power for themselves first. So Seanan, Middlegame is such an intricately plotted book. Can you tell us a bit about working with the various times and perspectives inside this one self-contained story?
I mean, my first tip for doing something like that is spend 10 years thinking about it before you create the document file. I tell people that that is the book I spent my career to date learning how to write, because every time you write a sentence, you are building the muscles that will make you do a better second sentence. And I publish a lot of books, and that's a very polite way of putting it. My output is actually greater than Stephen King's, which kind of horrifies me. So Middlegame is what happens if you take one weird, queer, neuroatypical girl, give her a word processor, and leave her alone for 8 million words. And that is literally the only way I learned how to do that, was by doing it. I'm not sure that I understand how I juggled all of the timelines. I wrote the entire first draft of that book in a white hot rage in 6 weeks. So it just sort of came out the other end in a semi-coherent piece after 10 years of thinking about it way too hard.
Wow. So you are rather prolific. You have another book coming out in October that is Over the Woodward Wall. It's the children's book that features heavily in Middlegame. Did you write that first, or did this one come first and inform that one?
If I were willing to show anyone the first draft of Middlegame, which I'm not, because again, I wrote it in 6 weeks. It's not very good. It is pretty terrible. That's its job. A first draft exists to suck. But if you go back to the very first draft, it was based around The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. My agent said, Oz is outplayed right now. You cannot base it around a pre-existing property. Because I had started with the perspective that Baum was the last of the great American alchemists. And that obviously didn't play out. So I went back, I ripped out all the Oz stuff, and I replaced it with the Up and Under, which let me say some really interesting things about the way that female authors are treated in comparison to male authors. I didn't have all of that subtext when I was working with Baum. It also means that I now have a core fictional author that doesn't come with all of Baum's horrible anti-Native American baggage and documented racism and all of that. So that was nice, but obviously Woodward Wall got written after Middlegame did. And I regret that greatly, because it means that when Tor.com said we would like to publish Over the Woodward Wall, I had all of these chunks that were already locked because they had already been published as excerpts in a different book. So I just created a file where I ripped all of the pieces of Woodward Wall out of Middlegame, put them into what I thought was probably the chronological order, and it wasn't, and then moved them around and wrote a book around them. But I couldn't edit those pieces of text or do anything to change them in any way because they had already been published.
That would be a unique challenge, I think.
It was a nightmare. I've already written the second Up and Under book so that if I get to do a sequel to Middlegame, I won't have to do that again.
Wow. Well, so Middlegame won you your 3rd Alex Award, which, you know, you're the first author to ever win 3 Alex Awards. The other 2, oh, sorry, what was that?
I said, I'm so pleased. Like that is a huge and disconcerting honor.
Well, the other 2 were for books in the Wayward Children series. So were you surprised that the award this time was not for a Wayward Children book?
I was surprised, and then I was angry at myself for being surprised, because I was a kid in the 80s and 90s before young adult, as the genre we understand it today, existed. And when I was in the core age range that the Alex Award is meant to represent, my favorite book was The Stand by Stephen King, because when I started reading it, it was the only book that would take me more than 3 days to finish. So my initial response was kind of, but that's such a big, complicated book. Kids don't wait. And then I felt like I was insulting the intelligence of my readers. It was definitely shocking to win a third time. Previously, I was one of 2 authors that had won twice, and the other is Neil Gaiman. So having the committee call and be like, hey, you have outpaced a white dude in your field was just like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm gonna say polite things, hang up, and go back to the D&D game I'm in the middle of. But it was very unexpected and very cool.
Has winning this many times affected your life or your writing at all?
My writing kind of just does as it does. I sit and I work, and I am a workaholic. I have finished 2 books during the quarantine lockdown. I don't do anything other than write and play with my cats and watch Top Chef on Hulu. So it has not affected so much. Unfortunately, not that many people know what the Alex Award is outside of library circles. And it is a very important award because I do feel like we sometimes, and I include myself in this, we sometimes underestimate the maturity of young readers and the things that will appeal to them that are not necessarily aimed directly at them. You know, kids are capable of grasping so much bigger and more complicated concepts than we want to allow them to have. And when I was in that age range reading things that were too old for me, I pretty much just skipped over anything that didn't make sense. So I read filthy, filthy sex books when I was 13 and did not retain any of the filthy, filthy sex because it just didn't make sense. I didn't want it, so I didn't take it. But when you say I've won 3 Alex Awards, people are like, that's cool. Did you also get an honorable mention for participation in your swimming tournament? They are given out by the same committees that determine the Newbery Awards. And suddenly it's very exciting, very exciting. So it makes me feel good because it means that librarians like me, and I love librarians. And also I like that the Alex Award itself is really heavy. Like if I hit somebody with that thing, they are about it, but it's a little disc of metal. It's sturdy as hell. So I'm not going to break it. So if there's ever a home assault, I'll just run for the trophy case and start chucking Alex Awards like
That is a hilarious mental image. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Okay, so I'm here to introduce Red, White, and Royal Blue. In this quirky political rom-com, first son, Alex, fakes a friendship with longtime rival Prince Henry of Britain when an incendiary photo of them is leaked to the tabloids. A genuine romance blossoms between the two, but it must be kept secret for the sake of Alex's mother's presidential re-election campaign. So welcome, Casey. Thank you for coming today.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the recognition and for having me. I mean, wow, thank you.
So just have a couple questions for you. So how did publishing your first book change your writing process?
Sorry, you cut out for a second, but I think you said, how did publishing my first book change my writing process? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I feel like for a lot of reasons, my first book, and I'm working on my third right now, and my first book was by far the easiest to write, and I think it's because I never thought it was going to get published. Like when I started working on this book, I didn't know any like I didn't know of any mainstream like trade paperback romance novels that were queer. and you know, that were like, you know, on the shelf next to like the Jasmine Guillory's of the world, and then all of those, you know, cute illustrated covers and everything, and I couldn't picture a shelf space for it. And I was like, this is so niche. No, like it's political and it's or it's just, yeah. And so I was kind of just like, you know what, I'm gonna have fun because nobody's ever gonna publish this, and I'm just gonna like show it to my friends, and it's fine. And so because of that, I think I just like, I wasn't overthinking too much of it, and I wasn't you know, I think once you know that you're going to like have an audience, it is very, very hard to shut down an imaginary audience in your mind and imagine like all of the ways each line could be interpreted, and you know, expectations and different reads of a book. And so I do think it's been a little harder to write since I've been published, just because I am constantly thinking about those things and also wanting to, you know, do right by my readers. But at the same time, I mean, one wonderful thing about being published is that I was able to quit my day job. And so I no longer have to write in like stolen 30-minute lunch breaks in between procrastinating on my work at my office job. So that is I think very good for my creativity, for sure. But yeah, and I think also just like the feedback that I've gotten from my readers has made writing so much more sustainable for me, because I have like this well of encouragement that I can always pull from when when I'm stuck, or when I'm stressed, or when I'm like, you know, blocked or something. You know, I'm very, very lucky to have a lot of readers who are very, very generous and kind and passionate, and yeah, so it's ultimately a good thing, yes. But I do sometimes struggle with getting out of my head, you know, when I'm writing.
Yeah. So was there anything that you edited out of Red, White, and Royal Blue that you wished had been in there?
You know, there was...
Am I cutting out again?
Yeah, but I heard you. In case anybody else didn't hear it, the question was if there's anything I edited out that I wish I could have left in. I mean, the first draft of this book was like 153,000 words, which is like insane for a like debut romance novel. That's way too long. And I managed to convince my agent to only make me cut 40,000. And so, which, you know, was like almost a third of the book at the time, which really hurt my feelings. But I mean, I think ultimately it's a stronger book because of it, but there were definitely more politics in that version, and ultimately the decision was like, okay, well, it's a political rom-com and the rom-com part's more important, so we're gonna have to cut some of the politics. But I definitely, like, one of my favorite characters is Senator Rafael Luna, who's like very much like a dark horse, mysterious, interesting political character who is Alex's mentor. And so in the first draft, he had a much bigger presence, and there was a lot more, like, I had a lot of fun with that character. And so I definitely miss him in the final draft. He's definitely very much still in there, but I miss those scenes. And, you know, a lot of dumb jokes, a lot of, 500-word tangents about like spoofing on, you know, Henry having to do an Olympics commercial or something. That was fun stuff that I had to cut. But yeah, I think ultimately, like, cutting it down was the right choice because I do think has a pretty fast pace now, and it's still very long. It's still like a 400+ page romance, which I cannot believe I got away with. But yeah, there were definitely some things that were hard to leave on the cutting room floor, for sure.
Well, we loved every word of it, so if you had made it longer, we still would have read it. So just for fun, what do you think Alex and Henry would be doing during the quarantine? and how would they handle it?
So I've gotten this question a couple times. And I think, well, first of all, it's hard because like the book is set in like 2020. And so if it wasn't already sort of a parallel universe, like it definitely is now, because like none of the events of the book are possible now. There's no way anybody was doing that much transatlantic air travel at this point in 2020. But so, and also I don't think that like President Ellen Claremont would let things get this bad. But so like hypothetical quarantine, just like a generic quarantine of a different purpose or whatever. I mean, I think that Alex is the type of person that can't sit still for very long and needs to find something to do and a way to pitch in. And so he is probably, you know, finding his local mutual aid fund and doing like, you know, going incognito with his mask and his hat to go drop off groceries for people that need them. And he's, you know, doing all of those types of things and, you know, ditching the Secret Service to do it. And I think that Henry is probably, I just finished watching Nadia's Time to Eat on Netflix. And Henry, if you've read the book, you know he's a huge Great British Bake Off fan. And I think Nadia would definitely be his favorite. So he's probably watched the whole series just like I have in a day, probably while like doing some baking project. I did it while making ravioli. So, you know, yeah. And I think beyond that, just going absolutely climbing up the walls nuts, as I think most of us are, unless you are Shannon, in which you've written 2 books because you're amazing. Which I'm very jealous of because I've written like half a book. But yeah, I think that kind of covers it.
Well, thank you so much again for being here. And we can't wait to read your next book.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Casey, thank you for joining us. I just wanted to say that I, as a librarian who's been doing a lot of telework, I've been sitting in on umpteen book buzzes, and you should get a bonus for every time a publisher's rep says, for readers of Red, White, and Royal Blue. We have heard your name, I think, more than any other. People are all trying to copy you.
Oh my God. That just makes me happy because it makes me think there must be like a bunch of new queer rom-coms in the pipeline, which makes me so happy.
You are a trendsetter, and you definitely filled a need for something that people really wanted. And this is a book that I've been giving out time and time again to the teens, and the buzz among them has been so strong.
The teens, my events are full of like the coolest, queerest teens, like so many like non-binary kids with purple hair. Like I love all of them so much. I just want to like put them in my little like baby Bjorn and carry them around. So many teen readers are amazing. I love them.
Thank you. Temi, you joined us late. I just want to make sure, is your audio working okay?
Hello, hi.
Hello, okay, I'm going to introduce your book, so give me 1 second to do that. Okay, great. Do You Dream of Terra-Two is a character-driven sci-fi novel that features 16 protagonists who are part of a 23-year mission to travel to settle another inhabitable planet. So welcome, Temi.
Hi.
Hi. And so we were wondering, what were the challenges of writing 6 distinct points of view? The committee all agreed that you did a terrific job in distinguishing those voices and making those very real teens. So what were some of the challenges?
Oh, well, thank you for that. Yeah, that was actually one of the real joys of writing it, because I was trying to answer the question, like, why would someone leave Earth forever? And I began by thinking about the kind of life that would motivate what the life would have to be like to motivate each person. So I have like one character who's kind of leaving a like slightly like neglectful home, and I have two twins, Astrid and Juno, whose parent is a missionary. And I kind of imagine they would have grown up in an environment where someone is always leaving and for like a greater purpose. And so I sort of imagine that they were influenced by that sort of idea of sacrifice. Yeah, one of the things I really enjoyed about it was that I loved describing characters from other characters' point of view. So sometimes I'd have an argument and one of the characters would, I don't know, be righteously angry and the other one would say she was actually quite spiteful. So that was a lot of fun. I think that's like just one of the joys of fiction, is that you can get into all of these other different heads. The kind of books that I love are where you can have this experience of lots of different consciousnesses, because it's so outside of our personal experience. I suppose one of the challenges sometimes was thinking that all characters needed to have, their motivations needed to be clear, and I wanted them all to sort of have an arc. I wanted, like, from the beginning, at the end of the story, they're all different people. So I definitely had to, like, sort of move chapters around in order to do that. But also another thing that I enjoyed was when I was writing each of the characters, I'd always think, this character thinks they're the hero of the story, which is kind of how we all feel. Yeah, so.
So you have a degree in neuroscience. How did that inform the writing of this book?
Yeah, I actually started writing this book on the summer just before I started my degree. So it was I was sort of doing it parallel to studying. It would kind of be like what I did in downtime, or I'd do it in the summer holidays or that kind of thing. I really enjoyed it because writing a novel, really, I mean, I think it's as hard as neuroscience, but it's a different kind of hard. So I felt like my life was really enriched by doing both of those things. One of the things that definitely I'm really glad that I studied neuroscience for is just that, like, especially for doing science fiction, you have to do a lot of research, and sometimes I meet people who are like a little bit intimidated by the amount of research you have to do, but I feel quite lucky that, like, sort of doing 3 years of the kind of study that I did has given me a kind of confidence that I can teach myself whatever I need to for whatever story I'm writing. Yeah.
What kind of research went into making the technical aspects of the book seem so realistic?
Yeah, so when I was in my final year, we got to choose a module, anything in the School of Biomedical Sciences that just it didn't necessarily have to be neuroscience. So I picked extreme physiology, which had it was described as the most fun module in the School of Biomedical Sciences, because there was one trip, and so you kind of learn about what happens to the body when you're deep sea diving, what happens during hypothermia, and I chose it because you also discover what happens to the body when you're in space. One of the recruiters for the European Space Agency came and gave us a lecture. And we went on a centrifuge, which is sort of what they use to train pilots. It's like a giant arm that spins you around, and you can experience, like, right now we live in 1G, but you can experience higher and higher Gs, which is like the kind of acceleration you'd feel if you were in a plane or if you were in a spacecraft. So I had a chance to I'd written the launch scenes already, but now I had a chance to kind of experience what it feels like to undergo sort of like 3G. And it was a sickening experience. We had, for some reason, they sort of video you while you do it. So the technician put in 2Gs, so you're sort of twice as heavy as normal, and you watch your face melt. And if you lift your hand, it feels twice as heavy. And the worst part is sort of when it slows down, you just feel really dizzy. And there's a video of me looking really dizzy and him saying, should we stop? And me thinking, but my character's experienced 3.5G, and going, no, it's fine, you should go higher. So yeah, I felt ill for about 2 days after that. But yeah, I tried to put as much of that sort of like physical experience into Juno in the scene where she launches. So yeah, that was sort of some of the research that I did.
Well, thank you so much for your book. We really enjoyed it as a committee. It was a very immersive experience. I think we agreed that it was a book that you kind of read in one gulp. It wasn't one that you were willing to put down. And I definitely, in rereading some of the book, I can see how the book has parallels to our quarantine experience.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot as well.
We hope that everybody here is going to pick up books that they hadn't heard of or haven't read before. Definitely do Dream of Terra-Two, including all our others. And we have one last book for you, alphabetical order, I'll tell you. Our last book is High School. Oops.
And I'm just going to read our description of it. Critically acclaimed indie rock duo Tegan and Sarah Quinn lay bare their teenage experiences, the oscillating euphoria and scintillation of first love, the jarring process of finding one's identity, and early forays into making music. Hi, Tegan and Sarah. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. This is just a total thrill. This is really delightful. It's been wonderful just seeing all of the interviews, and thank you so much. Really honored.
Your book is so detailed and so honest about being in high school. Did you have journals and or other memorabilia that you used to take you back there and you relied on to construct the book?
We did. Actually, Tegan's the diary journal keeper, so she had a lot more of that. Like, she pulled a lot of some of her own like dialogue with friends and experiences that we were having. And this is like the 1990s, so it was actually very helpful to sort of get into the flow of the way we used to speak back then. I mean, we're about to be 40 years old, so we think we still know what it is to be 15 and to talk like we're 15 years old, but thankfully we've changed somewhat. But Tegan used a lot of her own journals, but we also had a lot of VHS tapes of ourselves as teenagers. We had a lot of photo albums, notes that we sent our friends, that type of thing. So we were able to really immerse ourselves in the sort of like context and environment that we were in at that time. So it felt like while we were sort of reconstructing conversations, sometimes just from memory, there was real evidence of like, yes, we did speak this way. We did have this type of conversation, often with the people that we were either dating in secret or socializing with, or even just with each other. You know, I just want to shout out how many of you wrote about twins. As twins, we feel like twins don't get enough coverage, like, and don't get to have this unique identity. We're either like evil, we get to be evil twins, or we get to be sort of creepy. So we're just like really enjoying the spectrum of experiences that you all have given twins in the world. Thank you. We were trying to add to this canon as well.
And the chapters of High School alternate between your voices, but did you write the book together, or did you write the chapters separately?
Well, obviously, we are first-time writers and had, I'm trying to how to say this without outing us as being just total hacks, but we basically like wrote a 90-page proposal and sold it. And then I was just absolutely terrified because I realized then we were going to actually have to write the book. And we almost immediately started sending new chapters to our very, very generous and patient editors, who gave us a really wonderful piece of advice at that point, and said, you know, go back to the beginning, tear apart everything you've written, put it on a timeline, you know, just gave us some tips on how to make it less confusing. Obviously with two writers, it was, you know, Sarah and I did not write together. We did decide we were going to tell our story through both of our voices, through alternating chapters, that we knew right from the proposal stage. But yeah, so Sarah had like a full panic attack over text message to me, being like, oh my God, this is what they said we should do. And I was like, rules, I love it. You know, I was like very excited about the structure part. And yeah, so at that point, basically Sarah and I wrote down everything we could remember on the timeline. And then we sort of just divvied up the chapters, you know, and went back to sort of page 1 and started writing grade 10. And you know, when we would finish a grade, we would swap chapters, we'd lay it out and give each other edits and then move on to the next grade. So we, you know, we did have a lot of influence over each other's chapters, and we definitely argued a lot, like that didn't happen that way, or if you put that in there, then I'm going to write about how you were such a turd. And, you know, like there was a lot of like back and forth in that way, but I didn't want this book to become our perspective. It should be Sarah's perspective and my own. It was so important that I share as much of my interior world and my own memories of that time, but also not impose those memories or that interior world on Sarah's. So, you know, there was definitely a lot of tweaking to make it consistent, but that's sort of how we did it.
And the book ends as you're finishing up high school and you start your larger musical careers. Do you have any plans to write a companion book about the subsequent early years of your career?
I think that we're currently working on other projects right now. We haven't gone to that place yet. And I think it's just maybe because while it's been 20 years, we're still quite in our music, like we're like living our experience in the music industry. And I don't know that I'm ready to approach that material. And maybe that's a little bit of fear too, because I think so much of the early part of our career was was difficult. And there would, I'm not sure that I want to go and deal with, you know, misogyny and homophobia and some of the really awful stuff that happened to us when we first started out in the 90s. And I think I've avoided thinking about that period of our life because I don't know how it would, if I feel like we've accepted some of what happened. We feel like there's been change. We've become more successful, and it's sort of like revisiting that feels a bit like traumatizing. I think probably a lot of people think that about high school, but we really enjoyed high school. So it was actually a joy to go back to those early moments. But I will say that we are currently working on a graphic novel, and we are working on it together. Tegan and I are writing it together, not separately. And it's fictional for the most part. And I think that while we are musicians first and foremost, without a touring career, thank you, COVID-19, we are loving writing, and we are loving finding new ways to use our songwriting experience and skill in a new medium. So maybe we'll find a way together to go back and tell the story of our music career. I just don't think it's right now.
Well, we were blown away by your book. We didn't know what to expect, and all of us fell in love with it. So
thank you.
Congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thanks you to all of you. We have some general questions, and if you would like to raise your hand to answer the questions. I know Shannon has already made everyone feel bad by telling us that she has written 2 books in quarantine. And so one of our questions was going to be, how has this time in quarantine affected you creatively? And is there anything you're working on, or have you been having a problem working? Would anybody like to address that? I think, we hear from Maia and then Shannon.
I don't know. It's hard because I feel like in the very beginning of it, it was just several weeks of just unbelievable worry about everything in the state of the world, which has ratcheted up in June as I now spend so much of my time thinking about Black Lives Matter and what I can do to support the protests and those efforts. But also I'm an introvert who loves staying at home. Like, I chose a career as an illustrator because I wanted to be able to work from home in my pajamas every day for the rest of my life. And so in a weird sense, I'm like creatively thriving whenever I can put my worries aside. So yeah, I've written 1.5 comic book scripts, and I've illustrated a prose novel that someone else wrote. So like in many ways, I'm like, God, I'm such a hobbit. I just want to stay in all the time. If only I wasn't like fearful for like the safety and livelihood of like everyone in this country, this would be great.
Thanks. Shannon?
I think there's a lot of guilt being slung around, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, as people go, well, we're on lockdown, we can't travel, we can't do anything. This should be your most productive time ever. Shakespeare wrote King Lear while he was locked in his house. Hemingway wrote an entire novel in the time it's taken me to construct this sentence. Why aren't you working harder? And we don't thrive under stress. We are collectively experiencing trauma. Even those of us like Maia who like to stay inside are experiencing the pressure of not being able to go out. And it can be very difficult to tell yourself that your work has meaning, that telling pretty lies for money actually matters when people are dying of a disease that has been politicized, as if you could politicize a disease. Black people are being shot in the street for the color of their skin, when we're having to march during a pandemic in order to protest the killing of our own citizenry. You know, it is very hard to look at all of that and go, I'm going to write another fairy tale about kids having adventures, and that's going to make a difference to reality. I feel like it's a little bit easier for those of us who this is our job, this is our full-time employment, because if I stop writing, I can't pay my mortgage. And I have been homeless before. I don't want to be homeless during a pandemic. I really like paying my mortgage. I like buying groceries. But anyone who says that if you're not being as productive as Maia, as me, as Charlie Strauss, you're failing, is telling you a very toxic untruth that is hurting people very badly, and is especially hurting our young writers who are not yet in a position to do this as a full-time career.
Thank you. Anyone else? Temi.
Oh, hi, hello. Oh,
yes.
Hi. Yeah. No, I just wanted to sort of echo Sean's words, and thank you for saying that, especially because I'm nowhere close to have written 2 novels in the past couple of months. But yeah, I think I sort of went on a bit of a journey in the beginning of lockdown, because I think I was initially just thinking about myself and how I lived my whole life dreaming that somehow everything in my calendar will vanish, and I'll have a chance to write and finish my book. But then sort of the next day, I remember, because like I have a part-time day job, I remember leaving the office and everyone saying, oh, well, I'll see you. And then suddenly realizing that none of us knew when we were going to see each other. And I think that sort of like uncertainty actually isn't that conducive to creativity. But sort of like as the weeks and the months have gone on, I've been thinking quite a lot about how, you know, how all of these books about initially in the beginning pandemics were sold out, and now how loads of people are trying to like find fiction by Black authors. Like fiction is a really important way for us to sort of like recontextualize and get some distance from, I guess, like trauma and current events. And like our job as artists is so important, because like our job is just to reflect the human condition, and I don't know, to sort of like try and make something beautiful out of this moment. So it makes me, I feel kind of grateful that I have this job.
Thank you. AJ, are you still in Paris?
I actually left Paris as COVID was starting in Wuhan. So I'm in California.
Okay. Yeah. I know that I follow you on social media, and I see that you're working on different graphic design type projects. Are you working or thinking about another graphic novel?
Yeah, I mean, you know, speaking to all of you today it's always inspiring to meet other writers and hear your process and things, because it helps me. You know, as someone who had their first book come out and it was successful, and there's, you know, I think I have that expectation and pressure on my back to somehow one up that, or, you know, still just do maybe a better job than I did. So I've been thinking about it a lot, and I've been sort of conceptualizing or ideating as I work on my freelance illustration career. It's cool to take a break from what I did because it was so taxing. I think I was, at the time, I was working a full-time job as a footwear designer, and I was doing illustrations for like the New York Times and things like that, and I was juggling that with the book. So I was pretty burnt out after 3 years of all that. So it's nice to have some space, and maybe it's a little too much space with what's going on with COVID now, but I'm definitely thinking about it. I just think I need to find a story that sort of speaks to me and sort of has some urgency. And I think there's a lot of themes that we're experiencing now together that have sort of taken precedent, or like they're very important right now. You know, in regards to that question that we've all been asked, I think during COVID, I was concerned. My parents are nurses, but I work from home, so I was worried about their health. I was worried about friends and family's health. But you know, with this global movement that's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, police brutality, all this stuff, that it's big. I think this has been had more of an effect on me in terms of the purposefulness of what I'm doing. I think my focus has shifted onto that and sort of becoming more involved and sort of an activist on my own terms than drawing pictures at the moment. But yeah, I think it's been harder to create with all the stuff that's happening around us, this moment we're living in.
Yes, thank you for addressing that, Charlie. And I'm going to say that we're kind of going over a couple minutes. I hope people are okay with that. And I'd like to hear from Charlie, and if anybody else also wanted to answer. And if you need to leave, we understand.
No, I just want to say two very quick things on that subject. The first is that Tade Thompson, who wrote really good Rosewater trilogy, I don't know if you know it, but you should definitely read it if you haven't, wrote a very, very good piece about lockdown brain or cortisol brain, and the fact that if you're constantly under stress, it really, really physiologically means it's very difficult to be creative. And I think there's a long Twitter feed, there's probably an unroll of it, but his strand is definitely worth reading, because it just makes it very clear as to that kind of fug that a lot of us have been feeling. And I work in, half the time I'm a screenwriter, half the time I'm writing novels, and talking to both my novelist friends and my screenwriter friends, both here and in America, everybody is saying versions of the same thing. I'm just sitting in front of the screen and typing, and just chunks of crap are coming out. And you know, the quality has gone way down. But that's feeds the second thing, I think, for everybody, especially younger people starting out, is that you have to do the work. You have to manifest, because even at this moment when we seem incredibly powerless against all the really dark stuff that's happening in the world, I am incredibly privileged. I live in a house with 3 generations of working artists, and I see every day the power of creation and the agency it gives people. And what I wish someone had told me when I was young was that you have to do the work. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, it's often better if it isn't perfect. Work has to be bad before it's good. And I spent years not finishing stuff because I thought this is really bad. And I didn't realize you just have to get it down, because when we're not getting it down, everything is perfect. Every book I start, the platonic ideal of it before I write the first word, is the most perfect book anyone has ever written. And then I have to sit down and write it, and then it's signally not that, but then you rework and you rework and you rework. And I don't think it matters if you're a writer or a painter or any kind of maker. You have to manifest, you have to make it positive, you have to make it exist in a physical form in the world in order to make it good. And I believe that gives you agency, and it gives you power within the world, especially when you feel you don't have much power over the bigger stuff. And in the end, if everybody puts this kind of brick in the good wall, I do believe things will get better. I think they're particularly dark at the moment, both here and over there. But I do believe if people with good faith and good hearts keep working, keep manifesting, we have a chance to make this a turning point in the world, and things can get better from here. And this is undoubtedly one of the dark hinges of history, but hopefully it swings towards the light rather than towards the dark. Sorry, that was much deeper than I meant to go.
No, I think that was fantastic. And I feel like you've left us in a good place to leave. It was quite profound. I think you echoed some of the things that Seanan has been saying about, you know, that you've got to get it out, and the first draft is kind of garbage, and you've just got to get it out there. And I think what you said was very hopeful. And I think that's really important for everybody here, and for us to go back to our teens and young adults, that creativity can give you that agency, and you have to do the work. I think that's just perfect. This has been such a wonderful experience to have you all here. We felt like we knew you before. We felt like we spent so much time with you before. It was great to spend time with you now. We can't wait to see what else you all are going to do in the world. So thank you what you've done for us and for teens. I hope you all will be encouraged to read each other's work if you haven't. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.